Welcome to the Insurance Playbook podcast, the show where we pull back the curtain on the insurance industry, sharing real stories, smart strategies, and insider tips to help you win in the insurance game. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Spark AI Partners. Now, here's the reality. Almost everyone will file an insurance claim at some point, but most will walk away with less than they deserve. On this episode, I sit down with Brian Evans, the CEO of Eastern Public, to talk about how policyholders can push back, take control, and even win. From high-stakes commercial losses like a historic opera house flooded just weeks before opening night, to everyday homeowner claims, Brian reveals how a skilled public adjuster can turn the tables. We dig into the hidden coverages people overlook and the strategies that make the difference between a lowball check and a fair settlement. Stay tuned. This conversation will change the way you look at insurance claims forever. Brian, man, I'm excited to have you on. I was telling Brian, it's not every day that I get to have a little bit different variety on the podcast. I talk to a lot of agency owners and things like that. But Brian, you're the CEO of Eastern Public, and you kind of negotiate for consumers, right? People who are having trouble with getting an insurance claim. That's a completely different side of the world. Tell me why or how you got into that aspect of insurance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brenton, and appreciate the time and to be participating. So yeah, just a quick background. So I grew up in the construction business. My fathers and uncles own and operate a commercial and residential construction company out in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I grew up in that business, eventually started running that business with them, doing like design build work. And then, my father started to break down a little bit. His body started to break down. It's a hard industry to be in. And realized that as much as I really did enjoy doing construction and managing the business side of things, that, long term, it probably wasn't a good road for me for the same reasons, just seeing my dad breaking down a little bit physically. So I started my own building consultancy operation. And again, it was a bit more of extension of the design build work on a high end for mostly like high end businesses, commercial properties, things like that. And I had gotten retained for a large renovation project for an opera house in Pennsylvania. And this was an old opera house that had been out of commission for 20 or 30 years for most intents and purposes. And they were doing a historic renovation. They basically hired us to do that. And then about 2 weeks before they were set to have their grand opening, there was a bad weather event. A windstorm came through, and the existing roof that was on the building peeled back and flooded out the building in the middle of the night and ended up causing extensive water damage through all 3 floors of the building. Obviously, this was a huge issue because they were about to have their grand opening, and it was a lot of work that had gone into getting it a lot of work that went into it. And so that was how it started. And then the owner of that building was a developer from New York City. This property, I don't know if I mentioned, this property was out in northeastern Pennsylvania. And the owner of the building was a developer from New York City. And he had hired a public adjustment firm to represent his interests on the property and through the insurance recovery. And that company asked him, they basically said, they were a New York City based firm, and they had told him that they didn't really have good consultants out in this area of Pennsylvania. And if he had known anybody that would be of good assistance. And he said, well, how about the guy that built the place type thing? So that was it. So then this adjustment firm came in and they hired us to be the building consultants for them. Kind of a fun story. So they scheduled this meeting with the insurance company to come out and see the damages, essentially to review the claim that we had presented and to try to work through the discrepancies or differences between their assessment and ours. But by the time this had occurred, and I wasn't so much aware of this because I was just the consultant, but by the time this had occurred, the dispute had become fairly significant between the two sides. And so I get a call from the public adjuster to meet him on site to go through an inspection with the insurance carrier to detail my reports and to work through some of their questions. And when we show up to the site, the insurance company pulls in and there's like 8 of them. They've got 2 attorneys and building consultant and an engineer and a representative from the insurance company, right? This like whole team of people. And then it's 2 of us, me and the public adjuster. And I hadn't really gone anything like this. I had handled some residential projects where, a homeowner might call me and say a tree landed on my house and I need an estimate or something. And I may have to explain, but never and had done a lot of work on commercial properties, but never from a claims, really from the claims side of things. So this was really my first exposure to that environment, and it was a really cool experience. So while we were there, we, mindful of the 3 stories of this building that we had done substantial work on, I had my hand on everything. I knew that building inside and out, could walk through it blindfolded. So we walk in with all these people, and we start on the ground floor, and we work all the way up to the roof, where the damage originated. And as we're moving through, the insurance company's not asking me any questions. They're not asking the PA any questions. They're just talking kind of around us while we're standing there. And I can hear everything. They're just openly discussing the scope and discussing what they're saying. And, very matter of fact, like, all right, we're going to place this, we're going to do this, check, 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 go through the whole thing. But as we're going through this process, I'm listening to things, and they're factually wrong about many of the things, right? So, and primarily what was going on was that, one, by the time they had gotten on site, much of the demo the emergency work to mitigate the damages had already been completed. So there was a lot of elements that they didn't actually ever see, because frankly, they were gone by the time they got on site. And then the other aspect of this was that the matrix of the building, the way that, the flooring assemblies, the wall assemblies, the ceiling assemblies, the MEPs, all these different elements were not necessarily put together in a traditional way like you would see in like a traditional building environment. So all these experts were making assumptions and recommendations to the insurance carrier based on this experience, and really were not really interested in anything I had to say or anything that the public adjuster had to say. They were just telling each other what the answer was going to be. So I hadn't gone through this before, so I'm with them, and we work our way through the whole building, every room that was affected, all the way up to the roof with basically no questions asked. And we get up to the roof, and they're looking at the roof, and I tap the public adjuster. I tap him on the shoulder. I say, "Can we just step off to the side for a minute?" We walk over, and I said, "Look, I gotta tell you, I'm like, these guys, they're completely off base here. They really don't understand. A lot of the things they're saying here are not true, and here's why." And I start reading them off, like kind of like a laundry list of the things that they said and where they were wrong. We got about, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes into that explanation. He puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, "Brian," he's like, "do me a favor. Would you mind going back and just repeating all of that to these guys right now?" So we did that. We go back, and I tell them, kind of read them the riot act and explain to them all the errors they made. You can see all the light bulbs going off. And then, that's kind of the fun backstory to it. But long story short, we ended up like really crushing that settlement. The property owner was thrilled. The settlement was resolved fairly. They got to avoid litigation. There was a huge settlement that made everybody whole, got them back together. And that public adjuster basically, again, long story short, that public adjuster a couple weeks later offered me a full-time job to come and work for the company. And that's what I did. That's how I got introduced to the industry. And then I apprenticed with him for a number of years.
Wow. Wow. I love hearing you tell the story. It feels like I'm there, but what a crazy entrance. Had you ever thought about, did you know what a public adjuster was before you
No,
had that incident?
no, it's a great question too, because I think most consumers aren't aware of it, right? It's not a really well marketed or known profession. And even people that are aware of it aren't even really quite clear on what we do or how we do it. And frankly, a lot of public adjusters do it differently. So, there's some value to that. But yeah, no, I didn't know much about it at all until, this introduction to the industry.
Wow. So for some of the people listening here, do you mind running through like what is a public adjuster, and also who pays the public adjuster?
Yeah, sure. So the easiest way to explain it is, because everybody is very familiar, or not everybody, most people are very familiar with the term adjuster, right?
Mhm.
And I think conceptually how most of us think about that is that it's a representative who works for the insurance company to investigate your claims and pay them, right? That's basically the role of the adjuster. What has occurred though is frankly, insurance companies don't make money paying insurance claims, and they have all types of processes and procedures in place that are essentially designed to save them money throughout the claims process, and those processes leave the consumer at a disadvantage. And also the experience the carrier has going through the claims process, understanding policy provisions and insurance law and things that most consumers have no idea and are unable to really navigate without experience.
Mm-hmm.
So most states have recognized this as a major issue. And so they have they've been licensing for 70 years or better, professionals to represent just the interests of the policyholder. And that's what we do. So in the industry, there's three types of adjusters. And this is, again, something maybe most consumers aren't aware of, but there's what's considered a company adjuster, an independent adjuster, and then a public adjuster. And the company adjuster is somebody who is on the insurance company's payroll, who, they are a State Farm adjuster, and they investigate and make recommendations to State Farm to settle claims. Then the independent adjuster is a little bit of a misnomer because they're not independent in the fact that they aren't able to work for policyholders. They're independent because they aren't on the insurance company's direct payroll, but they're licensed by the states specifically only to work for insurance companies. So they're just essentially a third party who's licensed to represent the insurance company's interest. It's only the public adjuster who is licensed to represent the policyholder's interest, and only the policyholder's interest. I'm not able to work for an insurance company, only for policyholders. And that's really what that's the difference in what we do. And then our role is to, provide that insured with all of the resources, information, and experience that they're going to need to get through the claims process and restore their damages or their property.
Yeah, yeah. And so who ends up paying you at the end of everything?
That's a great question. Yeah. So we get paid, it can be paid a couple of different ways. Most traditionally, it's a contingency. It's a commission based payment on the percent. It's a percentage of the settlement. So we don't get paid until the policyholder gets paid. And it's really helpful to them in most instances because the traditional policyholder and vast majority of them, when you only have when you have a serious loss, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they don't have the money, typically are going to have the money available to hire the types of professionals they need to navigate that claim and to prepare all their claims, to deal with the insurance company, to, just move the process along efficiently and get them back into their business or home as quickly as possible. So what makes that helpful is that we don't get paid until they get paid, and it's just a small percentage of the insurance recovery. So it doesn't leave them disadvantaged in the fact that they'll still have the money to do the repairs or to restore the property or their business, but they won't have to come up with those funds until there's actually cash flow coming from the claim itself.
No, that makes perfect sense. So in essence, they're not having to come out of pocket at all. It just comes out of the claim. And then the idea is that hiring you, they're not going to have to do the back and forth. And with the insurance company, you basically take that role for them, going back and forth, or you at least provide the resources for them. And then in the grand picture, and in an ideal world, they'll get more hiring a public adjuster than they would have gotten by themselves. And then that's where you get paid.
Yeah, more or less that's accurate. And every public adjuster has their own kind of model and how they do business. Our model is a bit more involved, I think, than most public adjusters are, in that we really get entrenched in the recovery aspect of it. We're not just focused on making sure that the claim is amicably resolved and paid fairly, although that is the biggest part of what we're doing. We also, we really are there, to try to be there end to end, so to speak, right? We're there from the minute that you call us and get us involved all the way through to the final restoration of your business or property. And what that means is really helping identify contractors, helping identifying engineers, architects, expediters, and attorneys are often needed, or forensic accounting, and all these different, and it goes on, right? And so all these different types of professionals that are needed, not just to help support and pay the claim, but also needed to get you through and actually complete the restoration of your home or business. We hold the policyholder's hand through all of that with our experience. So we can engage with people that are on their team already and do that frequently, or we can introduce them to people that are qualified, that we have strong relationships with, that can provide valuable service. And then we really guide them with our experience to help ensure that they know the right questions to ask the engineer. They know how to deal with the contractors. They can, we can take 2 or 3 contractors and get a competitive bid together and level that out and make sure that they're getting the most equitable repair and help manage the construction, right? So, we can really help them in a lot of ways beyond just the traditional, making sure that their claims are paid fairly.
Yeah. I'm being exposed to a lot that I didn't even know. So this is amazing. I've heard of public adjuster and just like you mentioned, but I just didn't know how detailed that was. And I feel like, and this may be on a smaller scale than what you deal with, you may, sounds like you deal on more commercial, larger scale, but multi-unit buildings. But in today's day and age, would you say that some of the restoration companies, the ones that actually go out and do the demo and remediation and things like that, that they're kind of playing that role on a small part? Well, maybe not. They're essentially doing the restoration, but then they're kind of holding the person's hand in order to get them through the process. They're not doing what you're doing, obviously, by any means, but I don't know.
It's a great question, and it's a little bit of a pain point in the industry, so to speak, because on one hand, the answer to your question is yes, right? Every claim is not ripe for a public adjuster, right? A public adjuster is they're ripe when there's valuable service to be performed that's going to help the policyholder. But for, certain types of claims or certain magnitude of damage, policyholder is not going to need necessarily professional representation as much as they need a good, reliable contractor who knows how to prepare their estimates, can articulate the damages, and can help them navigate the conversation with their insurance carrier. So, for example, like a roofing claim, for example, if I had a wind damage and it damages the roof of my home, and I have a contractor come out, and the contractor's honorable and reputable and has my best interests in mind, and then I have them come out and give me an estimate on my roof, and they say, yeah, the whole roof's got to be replaced. It's going to cost you $25,000. Arbitrary example, but it's going to cost you $25,000. So I file a claim with my insurance company, and the insurance company comes back and tells me, no, it's $5,000. Right? There's a huge delta there, and for most property owners, that's not a delta they can absorb. Now, for
Okay.
the public adjuster, who's going to be getting paid maybe 10% or less of the settlement, and no good public adjuster is going to be able to validate the amount of time that they're going to have to invest to really help that insured for $2,000 or $3,000. I mean, there's just too much time involved to do that. And so most good public adjusters aren't going to be able to take that type of claim. So where does that leave the policyholder, right? How does that help the policyholder? They really need the contractor to be able to speak on their behalf to a certain extent. But more than that, they really, not that they're speaking on behalf of the insured, but they really need to be provided an opportunity to articulate the scope of work, why it's necessary. They need to be able to explain their pricing and why they're charging what they are. The red line that they're never to cross or should never cross is really negotiating. It's not, most states it's illegal. And frankly, it's not in the policyholder's best interest for the contractor to negotiate on behalf of the policyholder. In fact, if any contractors hold themselves out, and many do, that they will, and they're experienced with negotiating for policyholders, it's frankly illegal, and they have no business doing that, and it can really do a lot of more harm than good for the policyholder. But to answer your question in terms of what role do they play and where's the overlap, that's really where it is. It's on these smaller claims, and even on some larger ones, where the contractor needs to be able, or needs to be provided an opportunity to explain the scope of work that's necessary, explain the logistics of the job, help the insurance carrier and their representatives understand why the job is what it is. And that's a great role, and something that we work really closely with contractors all the time in that capacity, and happens all the time. But there's a fine line there that's really important for both the contractors and policyholders to understand, which is that actual claims negotiation, understanding policy coverages, policy interpretation, understanding the constantly evolving landscape of property insurance and case law. That is something that requires rigorous education, continuing education all the time, because it's rapidly changing all the time.
Hmm.
It requires a lot of experience that is much different than the experience that a contractor is bringing to the situation. So I think that, hopefully it answers your question, but it is very much a collaborative thing where both are needed in the claims process frequently.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you kind of diving in there. That makes a lot of sense. And it's all fresh for me because we just had a flood that we
Oh,
had to go through all that. We were on vacation, the most famous thing, right? We were on vacation, and then the cold water supply under the sink, I guess the PEX whatever crimp ring was leaking, and we came back with warped floors, and I was like, what happened? And like trying to
ah,
figure it out, and it went under all the cabinets. They had to rip off cabinets and countertops and all that. So we've been through it.
I'm first of all, I'm sorry to hear that. I know that is always really not an exciting thing to have to experience. You know, you had mentioned earlier, yes, majority of what we do is in the commercial realm. So, you know,
Yeah.
we're we're based out of New York City, but we work in 22 states across the country. We service the entire East Coast, so we do a great deal of residential work as well. And I would say that is more frequently than not what you find in. It's a very common cause of loss is that scenario you just detailed, right? We
Yeah.
went away for 3 days. I went to visit my nephew for his birthday, and we came back 2 days later, and the water's been running the whole time. Like that type of thing is very common.
Yep. Yep. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. We just wrapped up. Like, my wife's actually got a kitchen, so she's
Hey,
stoked. Feeding 5 kids with a little air fryer in the garage for 2 months.
wow! No temporary housing?
No, no.
Wow!
Maybe I should
You,
have
you
pushed for it. I don't know.
you needed a good public adjuster.
I know, because see, in our situation, what happened is we went the route of, like, we had some friends that had gone through the same thing, and they're like, well, we're gonna get X amount if we, well, really, we'll pay somebody and they'll just put it back the way it is, right?
Hmm.
Or we can take some of that money and then do it ourselves to save on labor, or do some of hire our own contractors instead of going that route, save some money and then get a couple things done. We live in a little
Yep.
bit older house, so we're like, okay, we want to, rather than just putting this all back, these are older cabinets anyways, like, if we're going to replace some of them, we just want to do them all. And at that point, it's like, we want to do a couple other items there, but what ended up happening, we didn't get quite as much as we had thought we would
Hmm.
for it all. And actually, I personally don't think there's any way that they could have even restored it to normal with what they gave us.
Hmm.
But yeah, I just didn't know. I didn't ask for anything else. So for temporary housing or for
Yep. Well,
anything else.
Brenton, you bring up a really good point because this is so common, right? One thing that I do a lot of pro bono work. We do multiple consultations every week, with different clients going through different situations. One thing that is happens very frequently is the policyholder is a little bit spooked that they're going to pay, let's say they're going to hire us, but they're a little spooked going into the process of a couple of things. One of them primarily being that if I give you 10% of my settlement, how am I going to have enough money to do my repairs? Like, if it's let's say $100,000, this family might not have, and that's a little, not necessarily that we're taking on a lot of $100,000 claims, but um, that could be $10,000. That's a lot of money to a family. So, if I have to pay you 10%, how am I going to finish the repairs? That's something that we deal with all the time. And really, the answer to that question is that, first of all, we never get involved in any project where we know we're not going to be able to provide valuable service, or where the service that the valuable service we can provide will be limited. That is not a good fit for them. It's not a good fit for us. So we always look at every situation carefully and see where's the value we can provide and what's that going to be worth to this policyholder. And if we feel confident that there's a lot of value to be provided, then we will help them understand that and hopefully be retained. But it's a very common error from most policyholders when we would tell them, you have some complicating factors here, like
Yeah.
whatever they may be. You really should have professional representation, whether it's us or any other firm that you hire. You really should do that. And then they ultimately decide not to because they're afraid, primarily in the situation where they're afraid that they're going to not have money to do the repairs. That is such a big mistake oftentimes. The reason being, kind of what you pointed out, is you don't know what you don't know. And there's
Hmm.
a lot to not know in this business. And there's just no way, literally no way, for a policyholder who is strictly relying on the insurance company, or maybe the insurance company and their contractor, to get everything that they are rightfully and reasonably deserved or owed through the policy, without having somebody who understands how to interpret that policy, how the carrier is supposed to react, how to prepare a claim, how to present that claim, really understanding what they're entitled to, what the policy provides them, and how to present and negotiate that to get it done, is just something you can't overcome the carrier's experience in underpaying claims without having somebody who knows how to do that. That's what the public adjuster does. So again, it has to be the right situation. Every claim is not a good fit for a public adjuster, but a consultation, and if you're speaking to somebody you trust and think is right, I always advise them, like, don't let the 10% scare you, because you're going to get way more than the 10% in value.
Yeah. 100%. I I agree. I mean, in this situation alone, just you're like, what? You didn't get temporary housing? You could probably bring up a number of factors and it would have easily paid for itself and made it a lot more comfortable and seamless for sure. So I'm curious, you deal with this all the time. Do you notice any patterns as far as things that policies exclude, gaps in coverage that a lot of people experience, or also the coverage may be there, but things that the insurance company will try to do or get around without you knowing? Have you noticed anything like that?
Yeah, well, I would say, in terms of the carriers this is a very big generality, but I don't think insurance carriers or their representatives necessarily are trying to take advantage or harm insureds in any way, right? The independent or company adjuster who comes out and examines your loss, the majority of them, some are, but the majority of them are not incentivized or worried about, trying to save money, right, for the insurance company. They're really trying to make sure you're paid fairly. But at the same time, their interests are not aligned with your interests. And for many other reasons, they're just not going to give you the attention and the level of detail and the information that is really needed to ensure that you understand how to do all these things that are needed to get your claims paid. And
Hmm.
so yeah, and so I just want to kind of like start off with that, because just through the door, that's not the problem. But more so, the problem is that most independent and company adjusters, frankly, are very much underqualified to the claims process. And what I mean by that is that in order for a company adjuster to get licensed, or an independent adjuster to get licensed, they basically take like a 2-hour class and take a small exam, and then they can go out and tell you, what your $3,000 worth of damages at your home are worth, or right. And they don't necessarily have to have any formal training. They don't have to have any formal background in construction or finance or retail or anything like this. They could have come from any background, taken this test, and they get hired by an insurance company, and the insurance company gives them their training and their model of how to adjust a claim. If you compare that to a public adjuster, it's much different. For a public adjuster, the testing is much more rigorous and difficult, first of all. So it's harder to get a license. To be fair, not much harder, but harder. And then second of all, public adjusters are required to take a continuing education every year. So
Hmm.
every year I remember each state is different, but it's, several hours every year of continuing education where you need to learn about updates in law and study how, claims processes and this on and on, all these different things that we're constantly being educated on, policy interpretation and such. That that really it separates the public adjuster from independent and company adjusters. And so much of underpayment in claims, I believe, comes from that lack of experience from the company side, and then also their own flawed processes, which are designed to save them money at the consumer's expense. All of that is to say, back to your question, which is, are there these things in the policy that often are underlooked or overlooked and not really used the way that they should be to help the insured, or gaps in coverage? And the answer is yes. There's lots of that stuff that we deal with all the time. Some of the more common common elements like that we see, I would say there's often underlying coverages in the policy and ways that the coverage is interpreted or applies that are defined within the policy that are really difficult to understand. For a policyholder, they may get a deck sheet, right, which is the first couple pages of your policy, which tell you how much insurance you have. But what most policyholders, most consumers, frankly, in general, just don't understand is that those are pretty broad, and that there's underlying limits of insurance that affect all types of things. For example, if you have a mold damage, and in most water losses, it's very common for mold to follow after a water damage if mitigation isn't effective. The mold remediation limits within policies are typically a sublimit of the total amount of insurance available, and those limits of insurance can be substantially lower than the overall insurance allowed. Right, so you may be looking at $300,000 or $400,000 on a nice residential home policy for repair or replacement. To the unwitting consumer, they may be yelling to their insurance company, "Look at all this mold! Look at all the mold that's caused," not realizing that the policy actually doesn't cover mold, or that it has a $10,000 limitation for mold. And presenting it or announcing it that way to the insurance carrier can really disadvantage them. Whereas it's presented differently or discussed differently and kind of examined in a different light, it could potentially be covered under different coverages in the policy, or money can be moved around to help them address some of those expenses, which might be otherwise subject to lower limits of insurance. That's one example. A couple of others that come to mind that are frequently underutilized or can affect consumers are increased cost of compliance or like zoning coverage. Essentially, my building, my home, my business was built 30, 40, 50 years ago. I had this bad event. I've got to rebuild it. But construction standards 30, 40, 50 years ago are not what they are today. And the increased cost to upgrade that property to bring it up to modern standards is also often an underlying limit of insurance. It's also very difficult to understand how it applies and how to recover those funds, how to document the claim in a way so that those are properly quantified and put them into a way that the insurance carrier is going to understand what the code is, how it applies, why it's relevant here, and how that's separated from the standard repair, because it's paid differently in the policy. And then the last one that just again, I'm just kind of spitballing with you, but the other one that comes to mind that we deal with all the time is also ensuing loss coverage. We deal with this almost on a weekly basis, handling coverage disputes for wrongfully denied claims. And essentially what that is, ensuing loss coverage, is basically says in your policy, it's going to say you're covered for everything unless it's identified in the following list, right? Something in variation of that. And then it lists out all the things that you're not covered for. So you're not covered if it's a latent defect. You're not covered if it's long-term wear and tear, on, right? All these things you're not covered in the event of. But what many policies do is there's usually a small section which will, later in the policy, which will reinsert that coverage, either in a limited form or on a full basis on what's considered a ensuing loss for what's considered an ensuing loss. So what that would say is that, okay, so if long-term wear and tear, if your loss results in if your loss is the result of long-term wear and tear, we don't cover it. But the ensuing loss provision would say, however, if a covered cause of loss ensues from the uncovered loss, we will cover that covered element, right? So a good example that let's say we had a water loss and the carrier argues that it was long-term seepage, right? And so we're going to deny that claim. But that seepage shorts out a wire and it causes a fire. So maybe the seepage element is not covered, but the damage caused by the fire would be an ensuing loss that is covered by the policy, right? So I don't know if I explained that well enough, but essentially you have these like different buckets here and in different ways and all these like underlying language interpretations of the policy that often leave the consumer policyholder leaving a lot of money on the table that they otherwise were entitled to.
Yeah, yeah. That's you obviously know your stuff. I feel like my takeaway out of that is it's like, on shows when they say, hey, you have the right to remain silent, da 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 da, attorney maybe provided one for you. Don't say all your crap right off the front. Like, get a public adjuster, and that way you're not forfeiting your ability to have coverage because you said something stupid to the insurance company.
You got it. You got it. And it's not that they're looking to take advantage of you in most cases, but what you say will be used against you. You've got to be smart about it. And look, we're not hiding anything as public adjusters. We're not manipulating information or changing any, right? But we also know, from experience, we know what's covered and what's not. We understand, the gray area between those things, and we can help frame it in a way that the insurance carrier understands why it really should be covered legitimately and what elements shouldn't be, versus just a blanket denial where, maybe a lot of information isn't understood or coverage is being denied wrongfully because they just don't have the data that they need to fairly pay the claim.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for the sake of time, I know I generally like to wrap it up here. But I did want to ask you the question that I ask everybody here, uh, and it's maybe a little out of context here, but if you had a magic wand and you could point it at whatever your biggest uh, issue is that you run into on a day-to-day basis, or just like something that you wish you could fix about in your company and your job and your day-to-day, what would you wave the wand at? What would you fix?
I love that question. Ironically, maybe I would say it's actually within our own industry, not necessarily from the carrier's perspective. I mean, an easy answer would be that, you know, carriers would start putting policyholders above profits and, you know, work towards finding better ways to service the policyholder and help them in the claims process. I mean, that's an easy answer. But I will tell you just from my own professional basis that unfortunately, like I mentioned with independent company adjusters, it's not hard to get licensed as a public adjuster. It's not hard to get a license. And fortunately, because of that, you get a lot of riffraff in the industry that, you know, anybody go get a test, take the test, pass it, hang a shingle, and then go represent somebody who's really dealing with one of the biggest traumas in their life other than death. And maybe and sometimes death's even included in these situations, you know, to really to be offering to help somebody who's going through that trauma without being a real expert, without really understanding how to help them is a great disservice. And it really has caused a lot of friction in the industry between public adjusters and insurance carriers, where the insurance carriers often look negatively upon public adjusters, or the representatives often will look negatively upon the public adjuster because they can, if they don't know what they're doing and they're not really working in the policyholder's best interest, they can do more harm than good oftentimes. So, you know, if I were to answer your question, if I had a magic wand, I think what I would do is I would really raise industry standards to help ensure, you know, to limit the bad actors that are getting into the industry and to help raise the bar for our industry as a whole from an education standpoint, and just to ensure that the people who are holding themselves out to be experts and offering to help these policyholders really are experts and are providing valuable service.
Great points. Great points. Yeah, I see that
Thanks.
quite a bit, and even in other parts of the insurance industry, you know, it's people get in and they're not always there to help and doing what's right.
It's really the same thing as the same thing as the contractors, Brendan. You know, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Very similar to the contractors. There's great contractors out there do great work, and will work with your insurance company to help get your claim resolved. There's a lot for the policyholder. They need to know that there's a lot more to a claim than just the brick and mortar of replacing your sheetrock or restoring your your storefront. So that, you know, that's one. But kind of on the same topic or same idea, there's also a lot of contractors out there that are not doing the best thing by the policyholder. They're not doing the best thing by clients. They're there to try to drum up as much business and make as much money as they can. And how do we see that manifest itself? We, you know, roofing contractors that drive around neighborhoods and look for roofing damage and then convince the policyholder to file a claim and let us handle it type thing. That stuff's just terrible. And it's causing problems for the industry nationwide and a real problem. And, you know, same thing with contractors who hold themselves out to be claims experts. They're not. It's not possible that they could be. You can't. I ran a construction company. I run a successful public adjustment firm, 22 people across 22 states. We employ 22 people across 22 states. And, you know, you just can't be an expert of all things. So you see it on both ends, right? It's really, and the insurance companies see it too. They see the contractors as a problem. They see the public adjusters as a problem, and they see them as a problem because they're driving up their bottom line, not because they're hurting consumers necessarily. But for both sides, from the carrier side and from the consumer side, really what we need are better standards and you know, to be focused on helping these people who've been traumatized and going through these situations, and not looking at, you know, our bank accounts to see how we can maximize our income. I think that's critical.
Yeah, yeah. I think that goes a long way too. When you can deliver that, people feel it. So yeah, I have been wholly impressed here, Brian. Just speaking to you, your wealth of knowledge and just yeah, it's been a good episode here. So I appreciate it. For
Perfect.
those people who are listening who want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way that they can contact you or get in touch with you?
Thank you. Yeah, I would recommend go to our website. Obviously, you can find us at easternpublic.com. And then also, you know, we're not licensed in every state. So, you know, if the first thing I would tell you is go look at our website and, you know, see if we can assist you or give us a call. We'll point you in the right direction if we cannot, again, at easternpublic.com. And otherwise, I also encourage you to visit your national and state associations. There's several state associations. And then, of course, the National Association of Public Insurance Adjusters, NAPIA.com. So if you're a policyholder looking for someone to help you, and you know, we're not able to do that, I encourage you to go to the NAPIA website. Those are the best public adjusters in the country that all participate in NAPIA, and that's your best bet to find somebody who's going to give good service.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brian. Again, just
Thank
super
you.
grateful that we could have you on here. And if you're listening to this podcast and this was helpful, if it was interesting, if you got something out of it, then please do us a favor and like, follow, subscribe, and or just DM it to somebody who needs to hear this episode. And until then, we'll see you on the next one.